Last concept for chapter 24 is concept 24.4. Speciation can occur rapidly or slowly and can result from changes in few or many genes. There's a reason that a lot of people, even scientifically minded people, don't like biology. Biology is squishy and messy and dirty and complex, and there's a lot of gray. And some people prefer the hard mathematics of physics or the clear delineations of chemistry. I happen to love biology, but it is a messy subject, and you have to be okay with that. You have to be okay with the fact that there is gray, and it is a continuum as opposed to some of the maybe the hard-edged facts of physics. So concept 24 is very similar. 24.4 is kind of along that lines of grayness that I was talking about, because it says speciation can be fast or slow. It can have a lot of changes or a few changes in genes. There is no one clear-cut answer here. On this slide I copied directly out of your textbook because I just like the way that they stated this and said this. It says Darwin faced many unanswered questions when he began to ponder that mystery of mysteries, speciation. He found answers to some of those questions when he realized that evolution by natural selection helped explain both the diversity of life and the adaptations of organisms, but biologists have continued to ask fundamental questions about speciation. Many questions remain concerning how long it takes for a new species to form, or how many genes need to differ between species. So what I love about this is it really goes to the heart of science. This many questions remain. If we had all of the answers, there would be no reason for us to continue to investigate, for us to continue to even have science as a process. We may never have all the answers, but science is a process. It's not a set of facts. It is a process for determining new information about the world around us, and we may find new information that replaces old information. Some people don't like that idea. They want to know the answer, and they want to know that that answer will stay the same forever. But that's not science. Science is a building, a getting better, of increasing the accuracy of our models, of increasing our amount of knowledge about the world, and this is very much true in biology as well. Let's start off by talking about time. How long does this take? How long does speciation take? How long do we need for one species to split into two or become a different species or something like that? Well, again, like I said, it depends. It can be fairly quick, or it can take a massive amount of time. Broad patterns, big picture ideas in speciation can be studied using the fossil record and morphological data, which would be the body shape and anatomy, including fossils, and molecular data like DNA and genetic type data as well. So we can look at kind of big picture broad patterns using a variety of methods. Let's start with some of the patterns that we might see in the fossil record. Fossils are an incomplete history of life prior to us. We will never have a complete history of life via the fossils, because fossilization is a rare process. The creature would have had to have died in a particular place, in a particular instance, and be covered up by the sand and waters in a particular way, not eaten by other creatures when it was found dead, things of that nature. So the fact that we even have the number of fossils that we have is pretty amazing. On top of that, you have to find the fossils. So we have a pretty arduous task of finding fossils and organizing them too. So we'll never have a complete picture, but what we do have is a pretty amazing set of data that gives us a lot of information. The fossil record includes examples of species that appear suddenly. Keep in mind, when I say suddenly here, I mean geologically speaking. I don't mean suddenly like within 10 years. I'm still talking of thousands and in some cases millions of years. But sometimes the fossil record shows examples of species that appear suddenly, persist essentially unchanged for some time, and then disappear somewhat apparently suddenly, again, geologically speaking. Two well-known scientists and paleontologists that studied this, Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould. If you haven't read some of Stephen Jay Gould's work, he was a prolific author and wrote excellent articles and books. I would suggest that. They coined the term punctuated equilibria, or punctuated equilibrium, to describe periods of apparent stasis, or remaining the same, punctuated by sudden change. Again, when we say sudden here, we mean on a geologic time frame. We're not talking on a human lifetime sort of time frame. The punctuated equilibrium model contrasts with the model of gradual change in species existence, and both models can be found in the fossil record. So when you look at fossils, you can, in some cases, see this punctuated equilibrium model, where certain species tend to appear fairly rapidly, and then they are there for a while, and then suddenly they tend to disappear. And then in other cases you find a nice smooth line of gradual change over time. You can find examples of both of these occurring in the fossil record. Again, this slide is so long and it has so many words, and I hate to just read things to you, but this was pretty important because oftentimes patterns in the fossil record are misconstrued, and you will get people who argue that the fossil record doesn't provide evidence for evolution or change over time, which is patently untrue. If you study the fossil record or you study the science surrounding the fossil record, there is important information that you need to take note of. So I did kind of copy some of this straight out of the textbook, but only because it is important to understand. So what do punctuated and gradual patterns tell us about how long it takes new species to form? So here's an example. Suppose that a species survived for 5 million years, but most of the morphological changes that caused it to be designated as a new species occurred during the first 50,000 years of its existence. That would be just 1% of its total lifetime, that species' total lifetime. Time periods of this short, 50,000 years, in geologic terms, that's pretty short, often cannot be distinguished in the fossil strata, in part because the rate of sediment accumulation is too slow to separate layers this close in time. So we're saying we have a species that survived for 5 million years before it went extinct, but most of the changes that occurred in its body that we would look at and say, okay, this is enough of a change that I think it's a separate species from this other one, occurred during the first 1% of that span. Thus, based on the fossils, the species would seem to have appeared suddenly and then lingered with little or no change before becoming extinct. That 50,000 year time period where there was change, we may not find the fossils for that, or like we say, that is such a small period of time as far as fossils are concerned, geologically speaking, that you might not be able to distinguish the different fossils within that little strata of soil or rock that we're talking about. Even though such a species may have originated more slowly than its fossils suggest, in this case taking 50,000 years, a punctuated pattern indicates that speciation occurred relatively rapidly. For species whose fossils change much more gradually, we also cannot tell exactly when a new biological species formed, because from fossils you can't tell who can interbreed and who cannot necessarily, since information about reproductive isolation does not fossilize. However, it is likely that speciation in such groups occurred relatively slowly, perhaps taking millions of years. So when you discuss fossil evidence and this idea of punctuated equilibrium and gradual change, you need to keep these terms in mind and keep these ideas in mind. Understand the strength of the fossil record, but you also need to understand the shortcomings of the fossil record, but be sure that people are not using or making up shortcomings that do not exist, or are saying things that are not necessarily scientifically accurate. Again, as always, I'm just going to tell you to seek out the strongest, best scientific information you can find, and that would be from noted scientists, from people who are actually working in the field of paleontology or the study of fossils and geology, and people who are publishing in scientific journals and things like that. Always try to seek out what is scientifically the strongest and most sound information that you can. The book shows a brief little demonstration here, or illustration, to kind of illustrate what we're talking about. If you look at these two time frames, or these two examples, models, you have time, of course, occurring here, and you may have a punctuated equilibrium pattern where you have a species that in a relatively short time, right here, begins to change morphologically between themselves into two separate species, and then there may be stasis, or there's not a lot of change for a long period of time. And if you saw something like this in the fossil record, of course this is just a model or an example, you would call this punctuated, a punctuated equilibrium pattern, where there was a period of rapid change and then there was a longer period of little change. And that is, say, different from what you might see in a gradual pattern, where you might see slowly over a long arc of time slow changes that result in the two separations. So you'll see, like here and here, you have the separation, but there's two different methods for that to occur. And this depends on what species we're talking about, and you will see examples of both of these within the fossil record. The punctuated pattern that we sometimes find in the fossil record, and evidence from lab studies that we do even today, suggests that speciation can be pretty rapid in some cases. In many cases it's a long, slow process, but it can be fairly rapid, and the book gives a good example of a particular type of sunflower that originated from the hybridization of two other sunflower species in a relatively short time period. So there are some cases where speciation occurs within a human lifetime, and we can actually see this occur. The sunflower example and the apple maggot fly that we discussed, and the Lake Victoria cichlid, the fruit fly examples we discussed earlier, they all suggest that new species can arise rapidly once divergence begins. Once you have a separation, and that could be geography or various other types of factors, but once you have a separation, once you have divergence, then from that point forward you can have speciation happen fairly quickly. The interval between speciation events can range from 4,000 years for some of the cichlids that they were talking about to maybe 40 million years for some particular types of beetles. It has taken an enormous amount of time for them to change and become different species. So the average is about 6.5 million years. So that's a process that of course humans cannot see. We have not even been around for 6.5 million years. The species of humans has not been around for 6.5 million years. So this is, I think, part of the problem that people have with the idea of speciation and evolution and change over time is we get to see such a brief snapshot when we are alive here on Earth. And other than that, we have to rely on evidence and the tools of science to show us further back in time to kind of piece together this puzzle and see the pattern that emerges. So organisms, we want to keep in mind that again, it's messy, it's biology. There is no clear-cut answer here to how long does it take for a species to arise. It could be, again, for species, we haven't even talked about other species, other creatures like bacteria and more simple creatures that go, that reproduce asexually. It can only be a matter of years or a very short time period for that to occur. But organisms don't have a speciation clock ticking inside them, causing them to split and reproduce new species at a regular time interval. Speciation only begins after there's some sort of interruption in gene flow between the population. Maybe that's changing environmental conditions or some sort of unpredictable event. You know, maybe it's a storm that blows a few of those individuals to an isolated island and now they are separate from the big home population. That's when you have divergence. Then suddenly you can have speciation begin to occur, and after enough time, even if you brought the individuals, the ancestors of those original creatures that blew to the island, even if you brought them back to the mainland, they can't interbreed with the mainland population anymore. That's speciation. Lastly, we're going to look at this last question about how many genes does it take to make a new species? That's a fundamental question of evolutionary biology that we now have a much greater ability to answer and investigate than we did, say, 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. How many genes change when a new species forms? And again, you probably won't like the answer because it's, well, it depends. And just like most answers in biology are, it depends. Depending on the species in question, speciation might require the change of only a single allele or just a few alleles, or it may require quite a bit of genetic change. For example, there is a snail, the Japanese, I don't even know how to pronounce this, Euhydrus snail. The direction of the shell spiral, whether it spirals to the left or right, affects its ability to mate with one another. Remember, we talked about an earlier example of a pre-zygotic barrier, and that would be in these snails that can't basically mate because the way that their shells are aligned keeps them from being able to mate. Well, that in this particular example of snails is affected by a single gene. A single gene controls that, so that single gene basically splits that population into two species. Another good example used in the textbook is a particular flower called a monkey flower. There's only two loci that affect the flower color, so two areas, two alleles that affect the flower color, and that influences the pollinator preference. So the color of the flower basically influences who's going to do the pollination, whether that's a hummingbird or a bee. The bees prefer one color, the hummingbirds prefer another color. That leads to reproductive isolation of the flowers. So you tend not to get a mixing of the two varieties of flowers because the hummingbirds all go to one kind, and so the pollen only gets spread to that one kind, and the bees only go to the other kind, so the bees only spread the pollen between the same kind. And so there is reproductive isolation between the two because of the color of the flowers, and that color is affected by only two particular loci on the genetic of all the genetic information there. So here's an example of that. You have the typical colors here, and then you have what they did, a quick little experiment basically where they changed the color by mixing the genetics, and you could see how that affected whether or not the bee or the hummingbird was attracted. So if you look in your text on page 504, you can take a look at that experiment. So in that case, it's only a few genes or a few particular small genetic changes that make the big difference. And then in other cases, there are other species where speciation is influenced by a large number of genes and gene interactions. So again, the biology answer is, well, it depends. It's gray. And I know that's not nice and clear cut, but it is the facts. So let's wrap this chapter up. Let's see, in chapter 23 we were talking about microevolution, the change in allele frequencies over time. We were talking about genetic drift and gene flow, natural selection. And now we've moved to speciation, which is where one population basically splits for some reason into two separate reproductive populations and becomes two species, and we're going to move from that to what we call macroevolution. That'll be chapter 25. As you've seen, speciation may begin with differences as seemingly small as the color of a fish back, a cichlid back. However, as speciation occurs again and again and again, such differences build up and accumulate over time. They become more pronounced, and eventually you have entire new groups of living creatures, entire new groups of organisms that differ vastly from their ancestors. And a good example is the origin of whales that originated from land-dwelling mammals. So you compare a whale to, say, some of the other creatures that it is related to genetically, some of the hoofed animals such as a deer or a goat or a pig, and whales look pretty different. Now that is divergence that occurred quite some time ago, and the different natural selection pressures and the environmental conditions have caused them to look so different now. Furthermore, as one group of organisms increases in size by producing many new species, other groups of organisms may shrink, losing species to extinction. Basically, on the tree of life, you have some branches that grow and begin to produce many twigs with a huge variety, and you have other branches that die out and are no longer around and they become extinct. And the cumulative effect of many such speciation and extinction events, that's what has helped shape the sweeping evolutionary changes that we find in the fossil record. Through the fossil record and through now so many other avenues of evidence, we can see these changes over time, and we can look back in the past and we can see how the tree of life has grown and changed and branched, and some branches die off and others reproduce into many new branches. And so that is part of the speciation process. In the next chapter, we're going to turn to large-scale evolutionary changes. How did we develop entire groups like flowering plants and mammals and amphibians, entire big portions of this tree of life? That's macroevolution. That's coming up next. If you have any questions, let me know online. Make sure you're keeping up with everything. Make sure you're taking all the quizzes, taking every opportunity to get extra credit. Please go watch the crash course videos and the Bozeman science videos. They do a great job of hitting some of these subjects as well. And again, contact me online or via email if you have any questions. I'm happy to help. See you later. Bye-bye.